I needed a break. Not just a weekend off, but a complete, total disconnection from the world. My job had been grinding me down to a hollow shell, so when I found the listing for a stunning, off-grid A-frame cabin deep in the Pacific Northwest, I booked it without a second thought. The host, a guy named Arthur, had incredibly glowing reviews. "The perfect escape," one previous guest wrote. "You won't see another soul," read another. They were right about that last part, but I've come to learn the hard way that sometimes being completely and utterly alone is the absolute worst situation you can put yourself in. The drive up was grueling. 2 hours outside of Seattle, the smooth, paved highway gave way to a winding, deeply rutted logging road. My tires crunched over dead branches and loose gravel, the sound almost deafening in the otherwise absolute silence of the mountain. The towering Douglas firs grew so thick and close to the road that they formed a dark canopy, aggressively choking out the fading late afternoon sun. By the time I was halfway up the mountain, the bars on my phone had completely vanished. I was officially off the grid. When I finally pulled into the gravel driveway, it was dusk. The cabin was undeniably beautiful, a towering structure of dark wood and glass standing stark against the oppressive, encroaching tree line. The entire front face of the A-frame was almost entirely floor-to-ceiling windows, clearly designed to let in the natural light during the day. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, those massive panes of glass felt less like a scenic architectural feature and more like a display case. If someone were standing out in those pitch-black woods, they could see every square inch of the living room, completely undetected. I shook off the creeping sense of exposure, grabbed my duffel bag from the trunk, and punched the code into the digital keypad on the front door. The deadbolt clicked open with a heavy, satisfying thud. Inside, the place was pristine. A massive stone fireplace, plush leather furniture, and a high-end modern kitchen. A faint smell of cedar and stale wood smoke hung in the air, masking something else, a faint, lingering scent of cheap aftershave that I couldn't quite place, though I quickly dismissed it as the cleaning supplies they must have used. I tossed my bag onto the kitchen island and decided to take a quick tour. There was a lofted bedroom upstairs, a sleek bathroom, and a short, narrow hallway extending toward the back of the ground floor. That's where I found the first thing that didn't sit right with me. At the very end of the short, dimly lit hall was a door. It wasn't a standard hollow-core interior door like the one for the bathroom. It was thick, solid oak, fitted with heavy iron hinges and a massive commercial-grade deadbolt right above the handle. I pulled up the saved listing photos on my laptop. They had shown the hallway, but the angle carefully, almost deliberately, cropped out this dead end. I tried the handle just to check. Locked tight. I figured it was an owner's closet, a place where Arthur kept tools or personal items, but the sheer weight of the door and the heavy-duty lock felt aggressively out of place in this cozy, welcoming retreat. I forced myself to drop it. I unpacked my things, poured myself a stiff glass of bourbon, and settled onto the couch, turning my back to the giant black void of the glass windows. I pulled out my laptop to message my sister through the satellite Wi-Fi, just to let her know I'd arrived safely. The connection was surprisingly decent. "Made it," I typed, hitting send. "Place is gorgeous, completely isolated." Her typing bubble appeared almost instantly, but before her reply could come through, the little Wi-Fi icon on my screen abruptly changed to a hollow triangle. The connection had dropped. I sighed, getting up and walking over to check the router on the bookshelf. The green power light was on, but the network indicator was completely dead. As I reached out my hand to press the reset button on the back of the box, I froze. From the other end of the cabin, echoing down that short, dark hallway, I heard the distinct, heavy, metallic clack of a deadbolt slowly sliding shut. My blood turned to ice water. I stood perfectly still, my hand hovering an inch from the Wi-Fi router, straining to listen over the rushing of blood in my own ears. Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. I waited for what felt like an eternity, holding my breath, waiting for a footstep, a floorboard creak, anything. Nothing came.
My mind, desperate to maintain the illusion of safety, immediately started scrambling for rational explanations. It was the ice maker in the fridge dropping a fresh batch. It was the heavy timber of the A-frame settling as the evening temperature plummeted. It was a stray woodpecker outside. I forced a shaky exhale, pressed the reset button on the router, and quickly walked over to the kitchen to pour myself another, much larger splash of Birkin. When I checked my laptop, the Wi-Fi was back up, though crawling at a snail's pace. My sister's reply finally loaded. "Looks amazing. Don't let the bears get you. Lock the doors." I forced a weak chuckle, but the joke landed like a lead weight in my gut. I walked over to the front door and double-checked the digital lock. Secure. I checked the sliding glass door leading to the wraparound deck. Locked. I finally sat back down on the leather sofa, but relaxation was impossible. Night had fully claimed the mountain, without a single ambient light source outside. No street lamps, no neighboring porches, no moonlight piercing the thick canopy. The massive wall of windows at the front of the cabin had transformed into giant obsidian mirrors. I couldn't see a single inch into the woods, but my own brightly lit reflection stared back at me perfectly. If anyone was standing out there in the dark, I was practically on a brightly lit stage. To shake the feeling of being watched, I turned off the main overhead lights, leaving only a small reading lamp beside the couch, and tried to bury myself in a book. The quiet was heavy, almost oppressive. Around 11:30 p.m., I was finally starting to doze off. My eyelids were heavy, the book slipping from my grip. Click. A blindingly bright, harsh white light suddenly flooded the living room, casting long, distorted shadows across the hardwood floor. I bolted upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. I practically threw myself off the couch and pressed my back flat against the rough stone of the fireplace, scrambling out of the direct line of sight from the glass. Outside, a high-powered, dual-beam motion sensor light attached to the eaves of the cabin had triggered. It threw a stark, sterile glare across the wooden deck and about 20 feet into the dense pine trees before being swallowed by the darkness. I held my breath, peering around the edge of the stonework. The illuminated patch of woods was empty. The ferns were still. The branches weren't moving. There was no deer, no raccoon, no bear. Just empty, silent forest. After exactly 60 seconds, the light clicked off. The cabin was plunged back into the dim, eerie glow of my single reading lamp. The darkness outside felt even thicker than before. "Just an animal," I muttered out loud, the sound of my own voice startling me. "Just a raccoon that scurried off." I barely slept that night. I stayed on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at those windows. The motion light triggered twice more before dawn. Each time I braced myself. Each time there was absolutely nothing there. Just an empty deck and still trees. When the gray, misty light of morning finally bled through the forest, I felt a massive wave of relief. Everything is less terrifying in the daylight. I made a pot of strong coffee, grabbed a mug, and decided to step out onto the front deck to get some fresh mountain air and laugh at my own paranoia. I unlocked the sliding glass door and pushed it open. The morning air was biting, smelling heavily of pine needles and damp earth. I took a deep breath, walked toward the wooden railing, and looked down at my feet. My stomach violently dropped. There, pressed clearly into the damp morning dew on the wooden planks of the deck, were a set of large, muddy boot prints. They didn't lead toward the door. They were positioned directly in front of the living room window, and the toes were pointed squarely inward, exactly where I had been sleeping on the couch. I stood frozen on the deck, my knuckles turning white as I gripped my coffee mug. The hot ceramic was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. I stared at the muddy treads pressed into the damp wood. They were massive, at least a men's size 12, with a deep, aggressive lug pattern like a heavy-duty work boot. The most horrifying part wasn't just that they were there, it was the positioning. The prints didn't just walk past the window, they stopped. The person had stood squarely in front of the glass, toes pointed directly at the spot on the sofa where I had been huddled under a blanket just hours before. The motion sensor light clicking on and off, it hadn't been a glitch, and it hadn't been a raccoon. Someone had been standing just at the edge of the light's reach, perfectly still, watching me sleep in this glass display case. My fight-or-flight response kicked into overdrive, but the sheer isolation of my environment forced a terrifying pragmatism. I couldn't just run. My car was parked down the gravel driveway, and if this person was still out there in the trees, making a mad dash for it might be exactly what they wanted. I needed to know if they had left the property. Setting my mug down on the patio table, I stepped carefully over the muddy imprints. The morning air was brutally cold, biting through my thin flannel shirt, but I barely felt it. I followed the faint, muddy impressions off the edge of the wooden deck and onto the wet earth. The trail didn't head down the long, winding dirt road back toward civilization. Instead, the heavy depressions in the pine needles hugged the perimeter of the property, staying deliberately just outside the radius of the motion sensor lights. They skirted the edge of the dense, suffocating tree line and led directly toward the rear of the cabin. I swallowed hard, my boots crunching softly on the gravel as I followed them around the side of the massive A-frame. The back of the house was completely different from the front. Instead of floor-to-ceiling glass, it was a solid, windowless wall of dark timber and steeply pitched asphalt shingles plunging almost all the way to the ground. The muddy footprints stopped abruptly near a rusted iron grate that covered a ventilation shaft for the foundation's crawl space. My heart hammered against my ribs. Had they crawled under the house? I knelt down, my knees soaking up the freezing moisture from the dirt, and inspected the grate. It was held shut by a heavy, weathered padlock, and a thick, undisturbed lattice of spiderwebs stretched across the iron bars. No one had opened this recently. I stood back up, wiping the dirt from my jeans, and took a few steps back to look at the entire rear structure of the cabin. That's when the horrifying geometry of the house finally clicked in my brain. Standing outside, looking at the sloping roofline, the A-frame extended a good 30 feet past the central peak. It was a long, deep structure. But my mind immediately flashed to the interior layout. Inside, the kitchen gave way to that short, dimly lit hallway, but that hallway only went back maybe 10 feet before dead-ending at that massive, locked oak door. I did the math, my breath pluming in the freezing air. The proportions were entirely wrong. There were at least 20 feet of architectural dead space at the back of this cabin, an entire windowless room or rooms completely unaccounted for on the floor plan, hidden entirely behind that heavy deadbolt. A wave of pure nausea washed over me. I practically sprinted back around to the front deck, threw myself through the sliding glass door, and locked it behind me. I aggressively yanked the heavy privacy curtains shut, sealing off the wall of glass. I didn't care about the noise I was making anymore. I marched straight past the kitchen and into the short, dark hallway, stopping dead in front of the oak door. I stared at the heavy iron hinges and the thick deadbolt. Then I looked down at the floor. There, resting on the pristine, polished hardwood just a few inches outside the door's threshold, was a single, freshly dried flake of mud. I stared at that single, crumbly flake of mud on the polished hardwood, my mind desperately trying to reject what my eyes were seeing. I slowly crouched down, my knees popping in the suffocating quiet of the cabin, and pressed my index finger against it. It was damp. A violent shiver racked my entire body. The timeline snapped into focus with terrifying clarity. The muddy footprints on the deck outside, the motion sensor light triggering in the middle of the night, and now, fresh earth inside the house. Whoever had been standing out in the freezing dark, staring at me through the glass, hadn't stayed outside. They had come in. But how? I had checked the digital lock on the front door. I had checked the sliding glass door. They were both secure. Unless they didn't need to break in. Unless they had a key. Or worse, they had never actually left the cabin to begin with. The realization hit me like a physical blow, the heavy clack of the deadbolt I'd heard yesterday evening. It hadn't been someone locking that heavy oak door from the hallway to keep me out. It was a double-cylinder lock. Someone had locked it from the inside of that hidden windowless room. That was it. I was done. Screw the non-refundable deposit, screw the 5-star reviews, and screw Arthur. I was leaving immediately. I spun around and practically sprinted up the open wooden staircase to the lofted bedroom. I grabbed my duffel bag, not even bothering to fold anything, just violently shoving my clothes, toiletries, and laptop chargers into the canvas opening. My chest was heaving, every breath sounding too loud in the dead silence of the A-frame. I kept glancing over the railing, half expecting to see a figure standing in the living room below, just watching me pack. I zipped the bag shut, threw the strap over my shoulder, and hurried back downstairs to the kitchen island. My wallet and sunglasses were sitting exactly where I had left them the night before, but the stainless steel surface next to them was bare. My car keys were gone. "No, no, no," I whispered, my hands frantically patting down my pockets. Empty. I tossed my duffel bag onto the floor and started tearing through the living room. I ripped the cushions off the leather sofa, checked the floorboards beneath the coffee table, and even dug through the kitchen trash can. Nothing. I tried to force myself to breathe, to think rationally. Where did I put them? I unlocked the front door, walked inside, put my bag down. I distinctly remember tossing the heavy key ring onto the island. I heard the metal jingle against the granite. As I stood paralyzed in the center of the kitchen, a scent drifted past my face. It was faint, but unmistakable. The same stale, sharp odor of cheap aftershave I had noticed when I first arrived. Only this time, it was stronger, hanging heavily in the air like an invisible fog. I followed the scent. It didn't lead toward the front door. It led straight back into the dimly lit, narrow hallway. Every instinct screamed at me to run out the front door and just sprint down the logging road, but the nearest town was 20 miles away, and the sun was already hiding behind the thick, overcast clouds. I needed my car. I took a slow, agonizing step into the hallway. The smell grew thicker. The floorboards creaked softly beneath my boots. As I neared the dead end, the shadows seemed to stretch and distort. There, hanging perfectly still from the keyhole of the heavy deadbolt on the solid oak door, was my key ring. My stomach violently hollowed out. I hadn't left them there. I hadn't even touched that door since I first tested the handle yesterday. Whoever was inside the walls of this house hadn't just taken my keys to trap me here. They had deliberately placed them on the one door I couldn't open, right in plain sight. It wasn't just stalking anymore. It was a game. And as I reached out with a trembling hand to grab my keys, a low, distinct sound vibrated through the thick wood of the door inches from my face. Someone on the other side was laughing. The laugh wasn't loud. It was a low, vibrating chuckle that resonated through the solid oak, but in the dead silence of that hallway, it sounded like a deafening roar. Every single nerve in my body screamed at once. I snatched the keyring from the lock, the metal scraping harshly against the brass faceplate, and scrambled backward. I didn't dare turn my back to that door. I kept my eyes locked on the heavy iron hinges, practically crawling backward down the short hallway until my spine collided hard with the kitchen island. He was in there. The host. Arthur, or whoever the hell had rented me this beautiful death trap. He was sitting in the dark on the other side of that wood, playing a sick, twisted game with me. My hands were shaking so violently I dropped the keys twice before finally gripping them tight. I had what I needed. It was time to get the hell out. I slung my duffel bag over my shoulder, but as I turned toward the front door, a terrifying thought rooted me to the floor. What if my car was disabled? What if he had dragged a felled tree across the driveway? The logging road was miles long, winding and completely isolated. If I drove into a trap down there, I'd be trapped in the woods, completely defenseless. I needed the police. I needed them on their way now. I lunged for the old cream-colored landline mounted on the wall next to the refrigerator. I yanked the receiver off the hook and pressed it to my ear, my fingers trembling as I reached for the keypad to dial 911. Nothing. No dial tone, no static, just a hollow, dead void. Come on, I muttered, frantically jabbing the hook switch up and down with my thumb. I traced the coiled cord to the wall base, then followed the main line down to where it met the floorboard. My stomach plummeted. The thick gray wire hadn't just worn out, it had been cleanly, deliberately severed. The two blunt ends rested on the hardwood, the copper wire gleaming inside the sliced plastic casing, snapped clean through with wire cutters. He had cut the line. He knew exactly what I would try to do. I dropped the useless receiver. It dangled and swung like a pendulum, bumping softly against the drywall. A wave of extreme paranoia washed over me. How did he know my exact movements? How did he time the keys, the Wi-Fi dropping, the laughing? He couldn't see the kitchen or the front door from behind that solid oak barrier at the end of the hall. Unless he could. My eyes frantically scanned the high vaulted ceilings of the A-frame, the exposed wooden beams, the ceiling fan, the track lighting. Everything looked normal. Then my gaze stopped on a circular plastic smoke detector mounted high above the living room area. It was positioned oddly, not flat against the ceiling, but mounted on a slight angle on a crossbeam, tilted perfectly to capture the entire open floor plan, the kitchen, the couch, the front door. Moving purely on adrenaline, I dragged a heavy wooden dining chair over to the center of the room and climbed up. I was practically eye level with the device. It looked standard, except for one tiny, glaring anomaly. In the center of the white plastic grill, right where the test button should have been, there was a tiny hole no larger than a pinhead. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, turned on the flashlight, and shined it directly into the tiny opening. A sharp, unmistakable reflection bounced back at me. It was the glint of a tiny, curved glass lens, a hidden camera. I stared at the glassy little eye, a cold sweat breaking across my forehead. He hadn't just been watching me from the dark woods outside. He was watching me right now from inside his hidden bunker as I stood trembling on a chair. Before I could reach out and smash the device, a sound echoed through the cabin that froze the blood in my veins. It wasn't a laugh this time. It was loud, metallic, and deliberate. Clack! It came from the dark hallway. The heavy deadbolt on the oak door had just been unlocked.
The metallic clack of that deadbolt sliding open was the loudest sound I have ever heard in my life. It paralyzed me. I practically fell off the wooden dining chair, my boots slamming against the floorboards as I scrambled backward into the kitchen. I didn't take my eyes off the dark entrance to that short hallway. Every muscle in my body was coiled so tight they ached. I reached blindly behind me, my hand fumbling over the granite countertop until my fingers closed around the wooden handle of a heavy chef's knife from the butcher block. I pulled it free, holding it out in front of me with both hands. It felt pathetically inadequate, a flimsy piece of steel against whoever was waiting in that dead space. I waited for him to rush me. I waited for a massive man in muddy boots to come charging out of the shadows. But he didn't. Instead, the heavy brass doorknob slowly, agonizingly rotated. With a long, drawn-out groan of unoiled iron hinges, the thick oak door pushed inward, stopping when it was open just a few inches. Beyond that narrow vertical slit was absolute, impenetrable blackness. No lights were turned on inside. But a rush of cold, stagnant air seeped out into the hallway, bringing with it the overwhelming stench of damp soil, rotting wood, and that sickly sweet, cheap aftershave. It smelled exactly like the earth underneath the cabin. That's when the horrific reality of the cabin's layout finally made sense. The hidden room didn't just exist on the ground floor. It had a trapdoor. It connected directly to the crawl space I had seen outside, the one with the rusted iron grate. He could move freely beneath my feet. He could exit into the woods, circle the cabin, trigger the motion lights, and crawl right back up into his hidden bunker without ever exposing himself. He had complete control of the environment, and he had just opened the door to invite me in. "I'm leaving," I screamed, my voice cracking. I sounded terrified because I was. I backed away, my eyes locked on the cracked open door, my left hand clutching my car keys and my right hand gripping the knife. "I'm walking out the front door, and if you come near me, I swear to God I will use this." Silence. Just the pounding of my own pulse. I took a step backward toward the massive wall of glass at the front of the A-frame. I needed to get to my car. But as I glanced over my shoulder at the pitch-black ocean of trees outside, the trap became horrifyingly clear. If I stepped out there, into the dark, I was on his turf. He knew the woods. He could just slip down into the crawl space, pop out the back grate, and be waiting by my car before I even made it halfway down the driveway. I was damned if I stayed inside, and dead if I ran out into the open. I took a deep breath, steeling myself to make a mad dash for the front door anyway. It was my only option. I raised the knife, preparing to sprint. But before I could take a single step, a heavy mechanical thunk echoed from the exterior wall of the cabin, the exterior breaker box. In a fraction of a second, the reading lamp, the glowing microwave clock, the router lights, everything died. The cabin was plunged into darkness so absolute it felt like a heavy, suffocating blanket pressing against my face. I was entirely blind. And in that pitch-black silence, I heard the unmistakable squeal of the oak door opening all the way, followed by the heavy, deliberate thud of a boot stepping out into the hallway. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was a heavy, suffocating weight pressing against my eyes. I stood completely rigid, my back digging into the hard edge of the granite counter, gripping the chef's knife so tightly my knuckles screamed. I didn't dare exhale. I didn't even want my heart to beat, terrified the sound would give me away. From the narrow hallway, the heavy, deliberate thud of a rubber-soled boot hit the hardwood. Creak. Then another. Creak. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't charging blindly into the room in a frenzy. He was taking slow, agonizingly measured steps, dragging the toe of his boot slightly with each movement. The rough sound scraped across the silence like sandpaper. He was enjoying this. He was hunting in an enclosure he had designed. My mind raced, desperately trying to map out the pitch-black living room. The front door was maybe 20 feet straight ahead. To my right was the leather sofa and the heavy wooden coffee table. To my left, the open space leading to the massive wall of glass. If I tried to sprint, I'd inevitably crash into the furniture in the dark, immediately giving away my exact position. I had to glide. Keeping my left hand flat against the cold stone of the kitchen islands to use as a guide rail, I took a microscopic step sideways. The floorboard beneath my boot let out a faint whining groan. I froze, the blood icing in my veins. The dragging footsteps stopped instantly. We were both standing in the absolute blackness, listening. The silence was so intense it actually rang in my ears. Then a new horror washed over me. The smell. It was no longer a faint, lingering odor drifting down the hall. The sickening scent of cheap aftershave mixed with the foul stench of rotting, damp earth hit me in a concentrated wave. He had cleared the hallway. He was standing in the open kitchen with me. "I know you're still here," a voice whispered. It was a raspy, gravelly sound, completely devoid of any emotion, and it didn't come from across the room. It came from the darkness just a few feet to my right. Panic, raw and unfiltered, hijacked my nervous system. He didn't have a flashlight, and he wasn't fumbling. Whether he knew the layout of the cabin by muscle memory, or he was wearing night vision gear funded by his glowing Airbnb reviews, it didn't matter. He was tracking me flawlessly, and I was utterly blind. I abandoned all attempts at stealth. I shoved violently off the kitchen island and lunged forward into the void, thrusting my empty hand out to brace myself. My knee slammed brutally into the sharp corner of the coffee table, sending a white-hot spike of agony shooting up my thigh, but the adrenaline masked it. I scrambled over the leather sofa, practically throwing myself toward where I knew the front entryway had to be. Behind me, the darkness erupted. The terrifying, thunderous sound of heavy boots charging across the floorboards confirmed my worst fear. He was incredibly fast. My outstretched hands collided hard with the solid, cold metal of the front door. I fumbled frantically, dropping the chef's knife to the floor as my fingers blindly searched for the deadbolt latch. I found the cold metal toggle, gripped it, and frantically yanked it to the left. I wrenched the heavy door open, a blast of freezing mountain air hitting my face as I prepared to launch myself into the pitch-black woods.
but my forward momentum came to a violent, jarring halt before my feet. A massive, calloused hand clamped down over my left shoulder from behind, its thick fingers digging into my collarbone with the crushing force of a vice.
The grip was inhumanly strong, the thick fingers digging so deeply into my collarbone that I felt the joint grinding. The sheer force of it instantly arrested my momentum, violently yanking me backward into the pitch-black entryway of the cabin. He was pressed right up against my back. The smell was unbearable now, a nauseating, suffocating wave of rotting earth, sour sweat, and that cheap, stinging aftershave. I could feel the heat radiating off his massive frame and the heavy, ragged sound of his breathing right next to my ear. He didn't say a word. He just started dragging me backward into the living room, away from the freezing wind of the open doorway. Pure, primal terror overrode my brain. I didn't think, my body just reacted. I still had my heavy metal keyring clenched in a death grip in my left hand. With a guttural scream that tore at my throat, I twisted my torso wildly and drove my fist backward over my shoulder as hard as I physically could. The jagged brass of my apartment key connected solidly with something soft, a cheekbone or an eye socket. The man let out a wet, startled roar of pain. The crushing pressure on my shoulder instantly vanished as he recoiled. Not wasting a microsecond, I threw all my weight against the heavy front door, slamming it backward into him with a sickening thud. I didn't wait to hear him hit the floor. I launched myself out the doorway and blindly leaped off the edge of the wooden deck, bypassing the stairs entirely. I hit the gravel driveway hard, my bad knee buckling under the impact, sending a blinding flash of agony up my leg. But the adrenaline was a raging furnace now. I scrambled upright, my hands torn and bleeding from the sharp rocks, and began sprinting blindly into the ocean of darkness. Without the exterior motion lights, killed when he threw the main breaker, the mountain was a suffocating void. The towering pines blocked out the stars. I couldn't see my own hands in front of my face. I just kept my feet on the loose gravel of the driveway, praying I was running straight toward where I had parked my car. Behind me, the heavy thud of boots hit the wooden deck, followed immediately by the crunch of gravel. He was already up, and he was fast. "You can't drive out of here in the dark," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the endless trees. It didn't sound like a man giving a warning. It sounded like a predator mocking its trapped prey. I ignored him, my lungs burning as the freezing mountain air scraped against my throat. I stumbled blindly over a deep rut in the road, nearly twisting my ankle, but I caught myself. The heavy, rhythmic crunching of his boots was getting louder. He didn't need a flashlight. He knew every dip, every rock, and every curve of this driveway by heart. He was closing the distance effortlessly. Suddenly, my hip violently collided with a cold, solid mass of steel. My car. I choked back a sob of relief and frantically jammed my thumb onto the unlock button of my key fob. Beep, beep. The sudden chirp of the alarm was accompanied by the brief, brilliant flash of the amber headlights and taillights. For a fraction of a second, the driveway was bathed in a harsh yellow strobe. In that split second of illumination, I saw him. He was less than 15 feet away, a massive, broad-shouldered man wearing a filthy canvas jacket, his face smeared with dark mud and a streak of fresh blood running down from his right eye. His expression wasn't angry. It was a dead, hollow stare of pure malice. The lights cut out, plunging the world back into absolute blackness. I yanked the driver's side door open, threw my entire body across the center console, and violently kicked the door shut behind me. I blindly slammed the palm of my hand down on the power lock button on the armrest. Click. Less than a second later, a massive, muddy fist slammed into the driver's side window with the force of a sledgehammer. The reinforced safety glass bowed inward with a terrifying crack. I scrambled upright into the driver's seat, my hand shaking so violently I could barely function, and tried to jam the key into the ignition. But as the man outside reeled back to deliver a second, shattering blow to the glass, the slippery, blood-slicked key ring shot out of my trembling fingers, tumbling down into the pitch-black void of the footwell.
The faint, metallic clatter of the keys hitting the floor mat sounded like my own death sentence. Panic completely short-circuited my brain. I dove headfirst into the cramped, pitch-black footwell beneath the steering wheel, my torn, bloody fingers clawing frantically at the rough carpet. Above me, the man let out a guttural roar of frustration. Smash! A second blow rained down on the driver's side window. A stark white spiderweb of fractures instantly bloomed across the glass, tiny, sharp shards raining down onto the leather seat and the back of my neck. The reinforced safety glass was bowing inward. It wasn't going to hold another hit. "Open the door!" he screamed, his voice distorted but terrifyingly close. It wasn't a frantic request. It was a furious, booming command from someone who was used to being in absolute control of his environment. My hands scrambled blindly around the brake pedal, knocking against old receipts and a stray water bottle. The darkness down there was absolute. Outside, the heavy, rhythmic crunch of boots suddenly retreated from the door. He was backing up. He had realized his bare hands weren't going to breach the glass. He was going to find a rock. "Come on, come on, come on," I sobbed, sweeping my hand wildly under the driver's seat. The sharp, jagged edge of a brass key finally bit into my cuticle. I didn't care about the pain. I seized the heavy keyring with a death grip and wrenched myself upright, slamming my shoulder hard into the steering column in my haste. Through the fractured web of the window, I saw a massive, distorted silhouette lumbering back toward the car, hoisting a heavy, jagged piece of driveway stone above his head with both hands. I jammed the key blindly toward the ignition, missing once and scraping the plastic before the metal finally slid home. I twisted it forward with every ounce of strength I had. The engine roared to life. Automatically, the high beams flared on, instantly carving a blinding, brilliant tunnel of stark white light through the suffocating darkness of the forest. The man froze, caught dead in the center of the glare just 5 feet from my front bumper. His face was a mask of feral, unhinged rage, the rock held high, his mud-caked canvas jacket stark against the pale light. Without hesitating for a fraction of a second, I slammed the gear shift into drive and stomped the accelerator flush to the floorboards. The tire shrieked, violently spitting a hail of loose gravel backward as the 2-ton car lunged forward. The man's eyes went wide. He dropped the boulder and threw himself wildly sideways into the thick ferns just as my heavy front bumper clipped his leg, sending a sickening, solid jolt through the chassis of the car. I didn't look back in the rearview mirror. I kept my foot pinned, the car careening dangerously down the deeply rutted, winding dirt road. The headlights bounced violently, illuminating the claustrophobic tunnel of towering Douglas firs that blurred past me in a dizzying rush. Every sharp turn was a blind gamble. Every massive pothole threatened to snap an axle or send me spinning off into the dark, steep ravine below. I was hyperventilating, tears of raw, burning adrenaline streaming down my face. I was finally putting distance between myself and that nightmare of a cabin. I just had to keep the wheels on the dirt. I just had to reach the paved main highway at the bottom of the mountain. But as I took a sweeping, blind corner about a mile down the road, my headlights swept across the narrow path ahead. I screamed, slamming on the brakes with both feet and throwing the car into a violent sideways skid that sent up a massive cloud of dust. Lying horizontally across the entire width of the dirt road, its thick, splintered trunk completely blocking the only way out, was a massive, freshly felled pine tree.
The dust slowly settled over the hood of my car, caught in the stark, blinding glare of my high beams. The felled pine tree was massive, at least 3 feet in diameter. As I stared at the jagged, splintered base resting on the embankment, the horrifying reality washed over me. This wasn't a deadfall from a recent storm. It had been deliberately, cleanly cut with a chainsaw. It was a calculated choke point, set long before I had even packed my bags in Seattle. He never intended for anyone to leave that mountain. My chest heaved violently as I threw the car into reverse, my mind fracturing into panic. I couldn't go back up that long, winding driveway. He was up there, and suddenly, cutting through the idling hum of my own engine, I heard it, the aggressive, high-pitched mechanical whine of an ATV engine tearing down the dirt road behind me. He hadn't given up. He was hunting me. I slammed the shifter back into drive. The massive tree completely blocked the road, but on the right side, there was a steep, muddy drainage ditch choked with thick ferns and heavy brush. It was a completely blind gamble that would either tear off my front axle or save my life. I cranked the steering wheel hard to the right, braced myself, and stomped the gas pedal flush to the floor. The car plunged nose first into the ditch, the front bumper burying itself in the wet earth with a violent, sickening crunch. The chassis screamed as the driver's side violently scraped against the thick, unforgiving bark of the felled pine. My tires spun uselessly for a terrifying second, slinging heavy, wet mud completely over the windshield and blinding me. In my rearview mirror, a single bouncing headlight pierced the darkness behind me, sweeping across the trees. The ATV was closing in fast. "Come on!" I screamed, slamming my open palms against the steering wheel. Suddenly, the front tires caught a patch of exposed bedrock. The car violently lurched forward, tearing through the thick brush, scraping aggressively over the trunk of the tree and vaulting up the other side of the ditch. The undercarriage slammed down onto the flat dirt road with a bone-rattling impact, but the wheels kept spinning. I didn't look back, I just floored it, the speedometer needle flying upward. I didn't lift my foot off the accelerator until my tires finally hit the smooth, paved asphalt of the main highway. I drove blindly for 20 miles until I reached a brightly lit 24-hour gas station where I practically fell out of the driver's seat, bleeding and screaming for the clerk to lock the doors and call the police. The immediate aftermath was a blur of flashing red and blue lights, shaken statements, and a trembling cup of terrible black coffee. It took the county sheriff's department 3 hours to mobilize a heavily armed tactical team up the mountain to raid the cabin. They didn't find him. He had completely vanished into the thousands of acres of deep, uncharted national forest, likely using the ATV I had heard. But what the authorities found inside that house still keeps me awake every single night. The police informed me that the actual owner of the A-frame had passed away 6 months prior, and the property was supposed to be completely vacant. The Airbnb listing for Arthur's cabin was a highly sophisticated fake set up using stolen photos and a burner account specifically to lure solo travelers off the grid. When the tactical team breached the heavy oak door at the end of the hall, they didn't just find a crawl space. They found a fully furnished, windowless, soundproof bunker. Inside, there was a bank of battery-powered monitors wired to dozens of hidden micro-cameras planted in the smoke detectors, the bathroom vents, and behind the two-way mirrors in the bedroom. But the most horrifying discovery wasn't the vast surveillance network. It was a detailed, handwritten ledger sitting open on a small wooden desk in the darkroom. It contained dates, physical descriptions, and meticulous notes on the sleeping habits and daily routines of over a dozen different people. My description was the very last entry on the page, next to my physical profile, written in fresh blue ink were the words, "Likes to sleep on the couch. Tonight, I won't wake him." I never go to the woods anymore, and no matter where I live, I always check the dead space.